Sputnik International reports second Russia-Africa summit kicks off in St. Petersburg. The idea of creating a platform for Russo-African cooperation was voiced by Vladimir Putin in July 2018 in Johannesburg in course of the BRICS summit. The first forum was held in 2019. Some analysts speak in terms of a shifting away from the unipolar or to a multipolar reality. But folks, I think that shift has taken place. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the second Russia-Africa summit is being held under the motto for peace, security, and development, with a special emphasis made on food sovereignty and enhancement of economic, socio-cultural, and security cooperation between Russia and African states. Dr. Horne, two things strike me about this motto. One, it's incredibly progressive, and two, it's more than rhetoric, because the countries that are involved, they're making it happen, and it's not being done at the barrel of a gun. Dr. Gerald Horne.
I think it's important for your audience to recognize that we may be in the midst of the evolution of a new world order. This is unlike the order that developed post-1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the development of what was called unipolarity, the era of the so-called sole remaining superpower speaking the United States of America. But this is a new world order that in many ways is the polar opposite of what transpired centuries ago, when a few nations in Western Europe were able to catapult themselves into global leadership, not least because of exploitation of Africa, not least because of the unlamented African slave trade. But today in St. Petersburg, Russia, you see the spectacle of independent sovereign African nations meeting with the Russian leadership in conjunction with sidebar meetings of BRICS countries, speaking of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, taking place in St. Petersburg, with that culminating in South Africa in a few weeks, where they will be deluged with memberships from countries far and wide for the possibility of joining the BRICS. This all points to this new international situation, which is one of the reasons why Washington and its allies lobbied Africa so furiously not to attend this meeting. But alas, at least we can say that the two giants of the continent, speaking of Egypt in the north and South Africa in the south, did manage to arrive in St. Petersburg, not to mention other nations such as the leadership of Zimbabwe. It's important for your audience to recognize also the backstory, the prehistory of this really remarkable event in St. Petersburg. What I'm referring to is the fact that as these Western European nations were getting fat on exploitation and plunder of Africa, you saw that in the 19th century, the rise of Pushkin, a man of African descent, who in many ways is the father of the modern Russian language. This is basically impossible to conjure in London, for example. It's certainly difficult to conjure in Washington, for example. And this was accompanied by the fact that Russia, not least because of its own self-interest, decided to back African nations that were seeking to stymie European colonialism. That comes down to Ethiopia in the first instance. Recall that when Italy tried to overthrow the regime in Addis Ababa, it was Russia in the 1890s that rushed to their defense. If you look at a book that you can easily find either online or elsewhere, a book by Robert Skinner, who was dispatched by President Theodore Roosevelt to visit Addis Ababa in 1903, what he talks about at length is the fact that in Ethiopia, there was so much of what we might call foreign aid from Russia, including hospitals. But this was based upon this idea that Russia should help Ethiopia to survive because Ethiopia already was being surrounded by British Kenya, by French Djibouti, by Italian Eritrea, etc. And Russia's idea was that as these Western European nations got momentum, they would turn their sights on Moscow, which, of course, turned out to be accurate. And the Russian Revolution we all know about and how that led to a new era of cooperation between colonized African nations and Moscow. By the way, I'm in the process of trying to get published a book written by W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, the founder of Pan-Africanism, written decades ago on Russia. He first visited there in the 1920s and came back as a devotee of the Soviet Union. But alas, the publishers in this land of so-called free speech would not bite. I'm afraid to say that might be the case in 2023 as well. But some of the points that I'm making here, he was making decades ago, but it was forbidden from the vision and the eyesight of a U.S. audience. In any case, going down to the present, we see once again with its donation of grain to African nations, including Zimbabwe, by the way, Russia is rushing to the defense of African nations in terms of food sovereignty at a time when the proxy war in Ukraine has helped to stymie that remarkable and important goal.
One of the things I want to ask you about is that, you know, the Russia and China has argued that Africa somehow, I don't know, you know, it is various countries, but should be part of the UN Security Council. The U.S. has kind of said, yeah, but without, you know, the voting or veto privileges or anything like that, at a time when it appears to me that the U.S. is trying to create a worldwide NATO that would, in fact, supplant the UN anyway. At any rate, your thoughts on that, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly it's going to be difficult to develop a so-called worldwide NATO. First of all, a charter NATO member, that is France, might have a thing or two to say about that. Recall that it vetoed the idea at the Vilnius-Lithuania summit just a few days ago of opening a NATO office in Japan, not least because France is trying to cultivate relations with China, which obviously is in the crosshairs in terms of worldwide NATO. In any case, you are correct to suggest that African leaders are demanding a full membership on the United Nations Security Council. The members today, that is to say, Moscow, Beijing, France, Britain, United States, etc., that's all a product of the post-World War II dispensation, which has evaporated. And certainly, I think that the democratic and progressive and radical movement in the United States should be pushing, for example, for South African full permanent membership on the United Nations Security Council, along with India and Brazil. This is the way democracy is supposed to work, not like, for example, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank headquartered in Washington, where Washington exercises outsized influence to the detriment of international peace and security.
RT is reporting African states' military claims president has been overthrown. Soldiers in Niger have declared a curfew and border closures in a televised address. Niger's top military officers have declared a coup in which President Mohamed Bazoum has been removed from power. And it seems as though Colonel Amadou Abdrahmane announced in a short statement that he's now in control. What do your sources tell you about this latest development, Dr. Horne?
Well, there are lingering questions. For example, is it fair to say that the coup plotters, like so many other coup plotters heading westward in Africa, all the way to Guinea-Conakry on the Atlantic coast, were they trained in the United States of America? That's an open question that we need to have answered. We suspect that the coup plotters are the equivalent of special forces and keep an eye on special forces because they've been involved in so many coups in the Sahel region, that is to say, that band of territory stretching from Guinea-Conakry eastward through Niger, through Sudan, which, by the way, is still undergoing conflict between special forces there and the broader military. Keep in mind as well that Niger is important strategically, not only because it houses a complement of U.S. military so-called advisors and so-called drone bases, but also because Niger has more than a complement of uranium, which is important for so many different reasons, particularly important to the French economy, since French electricity is heavily dependent upon nuclear energy, of which uranium is a component element. So this is an important event to keep an eye on, and do not be shocked nor surprised if it turns out that the coup plotters were actually minted in the USA.
Here's something important. Russia to replace Ukrainian grain at no expense for African countries. Very important for a number of reasons, certainly. There are neocons who are trying to turn the end of the grain deal into an opportunity to, quote, confront Russia in the Black Sea. And, of course, the argument that, hey, you're starving the poor people of Africa. Your thoughts on all of that, Dr. Horne?
Well, this allows an opportunity to return to very important themes. One, the Ukrainian Proxy War. And I'm afraid to say that evidence has now emerged, as I'm sure your audience is familiar with, that there might be a more malignant reason than we already suspect for this proxy war. That is to say, the relationship between Burisma, the Ukrainian giant, and Hunter Biden, the president's son, and how he was paid to sit on the board, even though, according to one insider in Kiev, he was not smarter than a dog. And we're all familiar with the idea that the so-called big guy, apparently a veiled reference to Mr. Biden himself, was in on the corruption. Reference here, the remark by a former spouse of Hunter Biden that when she visited the president's house in Wilmington, she was shocked to find that there was a full ballroom in the home. When is the last time you were in a home with a full ballroom? So obviously this stinks to high heaven. This may be one of the most corrupt deals in the entire history of corruption in the United States of America, which is saying something, which then leads us back to this question that you referenced with regard to the grain deal, which allows an opportunity to speak once more about how during the Soviet era, the Soviet Union stood by Egypt in 1956 when it was attacked by Britain, France, and Israel for control of the Suez Canal, how it supported and armed guerrilla fighters in Angola and Mozambique and South Africa when they were fighting apartheid and colonialism. In fact, Samora Machel, the founding father of Mozambique, was killed in the mid-1980s as a plane that he was in was directed into a mountain by the apartheid authorities. Interestingly enough, his pilot at the time was a Soviet pilot, which was one more emblem of this close relationship that is now blooming in St. Petersburg as we speak.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.